I would like to call on Dr. Folashade Olajubu for the keynote address, who is the keynote speaker for this event today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Folashade Olajubu.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I am both humbled and privileged to be standing here today to give the keynote address. And while they're sorting out the PowerPoint, I think it's only right that I do a couple of things. I want to first apologize for arriving late. Dr. Adeyemi has been my link person with Folashade International School, and she's been absolutely fantastic. But one thing she didn't provide for me was a helicopter. So I was sitting in traffic, looking at the time, thinking, oh my goodness. But I'm here now, and of course, without further ado, I can say that the traffic in Lagos that I've experienced since I got here on Saturday is enough to cause anybody to have mental health difficulties. Having said that, I want to express sincere thanks to Princess Pedro for personally inviting me. I was listening to Dr. Kadiri's keynote address last year, and she spoke about how Princess Pedro was into praying and fasting to get the keynote speakers here. So I'm sure she's done a bit more of that this morning to get me through the traffic. I also want to say a very special thank you to the Folashade Foundation and to the Folashade International School for arranging such an important conference. I also want to say thank you to every one of you for coming here today. You could be anywhere else doing anything else this morning, but the reality is that you, the parents, the carers, the educational institutions, the media, and other interested stakeholders are very important in changing the narrative regarding mental health in this country. Very much in keeping with the theme for the World Suicide Prevention Day on the 10th of September, we are here today collaborating together because suicide is not something that one person or one organization can address. We need to all work collaboratively together to bring an end to this scourge. So as I said, I am very passionate about us changing the narrative about mental health and mental illness in Nigeria. And possibly not for people in this room, because I know I'm speaking to a very educated group of people this morning. But I know that when I think about the 180 million population, there is a wide proportion of people who think of mental illness in the way that I first encountered mental illness as a young child of 11. To give a bit of background, I was born in England, and as Princess Becky knows, I came back to Nigeria when I was close to 11 years old. And when we first came back to Nigeria, I lived in a papa that used to be very well heeled. And I remember that when I first came back to Nigeria, of course, everywhere I went, mommy puts me in the car with the driver. But as I got a little bit older, about 12, they started giving me a bit of freedom and allowed me to walk to the local shops. Now, to my shock and my horror, maybe the first or second time I went to the shops, I was walking down the street and I saw this man, stark naked. As a 12-year-old, I'd never seen a naked man. And I had definitely never seen an individual who was acutely unwell. But now with 20/20 vision, I understand that this man was acutely mentally unwell and he was suffering from something called psychosis. It's an indictment on our nation that this man remained on the street, from my recollection, for at least another 3 to 4 years. And then one day I would walk into the shops and his body was there dead on the street. Now, this is not a made-up story. That was my first encounter with mental illness, mental disorder. And the challenge really is that most people, when they think about mental illness or mental disorder, that is their snapshot. They think about the quote-unquote the madman. As a psychiatrist, I wouldn't ever use the word mad, but I know that that's what people think of in our community when they think about mental illness and mental health. And so today, I start off by saying that we in this room need to start a conversation which I'm praying will go beyond this auditorium and will begin to change the narrative. I always tell people wherever I go, because I also realize amongst our population that we always use mental health and mental illness and we interchange. Everybody has mental health. I'm a doctor who specialized in psychiatry and mental health. And we all have mental health, just like we have physical health. The issue then becomes whether your mental health is good or not so good. And just like there are parameters for physical health, which enable you to know whether your physical health is good or not so good, such as your weight or your blood pressure, your blood glucose levels, it is the same with physical health. There are some parameters that will indicate to you whether your mental health is good or not so good. And I'm hoping that as I progress in this address, you will have a clearer understanding of some of the things that we need to think about individually and collectively to promote good mental health. Things like sleeping well, eating a balanced diet, making sure to have rest, leisure, look after our physical health, exercise, spend time with loved ones and relatives, and also be quick to seek appropriate interventions if we realize that our mental health is beginning to slide. I also have to say that stress can tip one into mental illness. And as I said today, Princess Baby knows I was so stressed coming in the car this morning. And actually, every day since I've been here that I've gone out. And I think to myself, just the traffic alone in Lagos is enough to tip somebody over the edge. But together, we will change the narrative of mental health. I want to take this back. Take. Right. So, as was stated by the gentleman who came up before, or the two gentlemen, today is the World Mental Health Day. And the theme for today is working together to prevent suicide, a day for 40 seconds of action. Now, I know the learning gentleman who came before quoted some of the statistics, and I'm still going to go back and share some more. But the reason why the World Mental Health Day theme is a day for 40 seconds of action is, as has been highlighted previously, across the globe, every 40 minutes, somebody takes their life through suicide. And so the World Mental Federation, who instituted the World Mental Health Day from 1992, are wanting every single individual to raise awareness about suicide. And there are a number of things they would like us to do. And it is very laudable that the Folashade International School are doing this today. But the aim is that not just the international, but us individually, look at how we can reduce the risk of suicide. And so they're asking us today, but I'm asking you to take it beyond today to do the following. Improve awareness of the significance of suicide as a global public health problem. I want to emphasize that suicide is a public health problem. It's not a crime, and I'm still going to touch upon the legislation in this country, which sadly states that undertaking suicide is actually a crime, but actually the World Health Organization sees suicide as a public health problem. 2, we are encouraged to improve knowledge of what can be done to prevent suicide. And I'm hoping that what we're doing today will go in no small measure to doing that. 3, they are wanting us to reduce the stigma associated with suicide. In England, one of the major telecommunication companies says it is good to talk. And I'm hoping today that as we talk and have discussions, that we will help to raise the myths around mental illness and therefore help to reduce the stigma. And finally, they want us to let people who are struggling know that they are not alone. So, I have been asked to talk today, and I want to quote it properly. So I'm going to put my glasses on so that I quote it properly. So I've been asked today to talk about the alarming statistics in young people rising to the challenge concerning Nigerian youth and suicide. And it is my hope and my desire that when we leave here today, we together would have achieved the following. One, we leave here today with a better understanding of the factors which contribute to mental health difficulties and mental illness. Two, that each one of us will feel better equipped to promote mental well-being, especially in young people. Three, that we will be better able to recognize individuals, including young people who are psychologically distressed, and we will feel better able to signpost them to appropriate support. Four, that we begin the process, as I've said before, and I'm passionate about it, about changing the narrative about mental health and mental illness in our local communities and by extension the nation. And five, that by doing all of the above, we save lives and reduce the risk of suicide. So, the question is, isn't it, why the focus on suicide and suicide prevention? And to put this in context, the theme of today's World Mental Health Day is about suicide prevention, a day for 40 seconds of action. But interestingly, last month in September was actually a World Suicide Prevention Month. And again, on the 10th of September, there was a specific day earmarked globally, again regarding suicide prevention. So why are people within public mental health talking so much about suicide globally? Before I get into why that is the case, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And again, I know I'm standing before very learned people, but forgive me. 2 weeks ago, I was just reading of a mental health advocate based in London and somebody on Facebook. And I was actually shocked that the person didn't actually know what suicide was. So for the sake of any doubt, I just thought it important to start by actually defining what is meant by suicide. And very simply, it is the act of intentionally ending one's life. Now, I want to clarify that the act of suicide is not the same as self-harm. I know amongst young people now, there is a rising trend of young people self-harming in terms of cutting or taking overdoses. But when you speak to young people who are self-harming, as opposed to trying to end their life, they tell you that they're not trying to kill themselves. Rather, the cutting or whatever else they engage in is a form of relieving tension because of the stress they experience. I want to also emphasize that suicide is not accidentally taking your life. So sadly, a little while ago, I had to attend a coroner's court because somebody that I know quite intimately had ended their life. And this took place in King's Cross, London. And at the end of a 3-day coroner's hearing, the coroner decided with the jury that they had to label it as misadventure because they were not entirely sure as to the person's state of mind when they ended their life. And for a life to be classified as suicide, one has to be sure that the person actually intended to end their life. That feeds into what the World Health Organization has said, that although they've come up with these statistics, they realize that suicide is often underreported. One, because sometimes one cannot determine whether indeed it was suicide. but also because of stigma and underreporting cultural norms. So, my learned gentleman has already given some of the statistics, but I heard that, to learn, you need to hear something possibly 21 times. I'm also a lecturer, so forgive me if I'm repeating the statistics, but I think they're important. The World Health Organization says that 800,000 individuals globally take their own lives every year. And every 40 seconds, someone on the planet commits suicide. So for those of us who have been here from 9 o'clock, can you do the sums? Can you imagine how many people have ended their life from 9 o'clock up until now, and we're looking at 5 minutes to 11? 79% of suicides are said to occur in low and middle income countries. And it's easy to understand why. Because some of the factors that lead to suicide include socioeconomic stresses. Sadly, suicide rates have increased globally by 60% in the last 45 years. And as I've said before, and as my learning colleague said earlier, for every confirmed suicide, the World Health Organization says there are possibly 10 further attempts, and there are possibly more people who have committed suicide, but it's difficult to determine without any shadow of a doubt. Why are we focusing on the youth? I'm going to start by sharing some UK statistics, and then I'm going to bring it home to Nigeria. The Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom previously stated that 1 in 10 children between the age of 5 to 15 suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. However, this year they have released new statistics, having done a further survey, and they found out that the rate had increased. In children aged 5 to 19, 1 out of every 9 children will have a diagnosable mental disorder. And if you extend the age range from 5 to 19, that goes up to 1 in 8 children. That is a lot of young people experiencing mental health distress and mental health difficulties. The statistics found out that in terms of mental disorder, for boys, they tended to experience it at a younger age group. But when it came to the teenage years, and specifically women, 1 in 4 women between the age of 17 and 19 suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. And sadly, in this survey that was conducted, 52.7% of young women gave a self-report of either self-harm or attempted suicide. I would suggest to each one of us that that is a lot of young people who are thinking about or acting on thoughts to end their life. And we need to think about why. So, I'm here to say that suicide is snuffing out our young people. And I'm soon going to bring the statistics home to Nigeria. But as we heard before, and I don't think we can hear it too often, suicide is the most common cause of death for men aged 20 to 49 years in the UK, and I actually understand globally. And suicide is the second highest cause of death globally for men 15 to 29. That means, put very simply, that men and women are dying in their prime. And there are so many costs to the loss of people at a young age, be it financial costs, direct and indirect, or the human costs. The World Health Organization says that for every person who successfully, I don't want to use the word successfully, who completes suicide, 20 people will be affected. I would like to suggest to you that within our culture, it will be so much more. Again, I want to emphasize that the WHO sees suicide as a public health concern. And I'm hoping that you, the stakeholders in this room, will begin to take that message out there so that we can change the way we see suicide in this our dear country. So, I want to bring it back home to Nigeria. And I start off by saying that Nigeria is a young population. And what do I mean by that? I went to check the life expectancy in Nigeria. When I was in medical school many years ago, the average life expectancy was 48 years. I have to tell you, I left medical school over 30 years ago. I can see a friend of mine, she's laughing at me, we're in university at the same time. But it is shocking, and I say truly shocking, that 30 years after I left medical school, the life expectancy in Nigeria has not improved that dramatically. The life expectancy in this country is 54 and a half years. I am actually older than the Nigerian life expectancy. For men, it is actually 53.7 years, and for women, 54.5. It is appalling. And I think it says a lot about our health systems in this country. And again, I'm hoping that we will take this narrative outside. So if we think about the fact that as a nation we have a very young population, it's even more important that we address suicide because we are truly losing our main workforce. I went to do a little bit of research myself, and I found out from reading some academic papers that the average suicide rates in Nigeria have increased dramatically between 2012 and 2017. And sadly, Nigeria is deemed as the 15th highest in terms of suicide. But here are the shocking statistics. Although when rated globally in terms of men, we are 56 on the pecking order. For women, we rank third. In terms of high suicide risk groups, it is the young pregnant women, immigrants, prisoners, military personnel, individuals who are questioning their sexuality, and sadly, Nigerian women. I had to think about why that would be the case, and I stand to be proven wrong, but I think it's something about our cultural values in this country, about the fact that women in this country are often deemed as second-class citizens, that women in this country are often subject to physical, sexual, and financial and other forms of abuse, that the culture sadly seems to promote this kind of lifestyle. And I'm very grateful for the things that I'm now beginning to see in the media. I'm not here to name specifics, but I'm sure most of us have been listening to the news about sex for grades, etc., etc. And so, at last, I think that what is happening is that we're beginning to have a conversation about those things that affect women in our nation, which increase the risk of suicide. But again, we're doing something very important here. It is shocking that we rank number 3 in the world in terms of female suicide. So, what I want to do now is talk about the global perspective on suicide, then bring it to the national level, and then bring it down to the schools. So globally, the World Health Organization started a mental health action plan which was to span between 2013 to 2020. And it was said that the global imperative was to reduce suicide by 10% by 2020. Well, I'm sad to say that if we're just beginning to have these discussions in Nigeria now, in October 2019, it's highly unlikely that we're going to achieve this goal. In fact, as I said from the statistics, we found that suicide rates has increased dramatically from 2012. I'm going to jump over this, but this basically just talks about some of the strategies that are required in any nation to reduce suicide, including the need to strengthen effective leadership and governance for mental health, to provide comprehensive, integrated, and responsive mental health and social care services in community-based settings, to implement strategy for promotion and prevention in mental health, and strengthen information systems, evidence and research for mental health. And the WHO pointed out that there needs to be strategies which are global, national, multi-sectorial, and I believe that what we're doing today is within the multi-sectorial. It is sad, I remember working very briefly at Yaba Psychiatric Hospital in 1989 to 1990. And I'm sad to say that I do not feel that there has been much change in terms of provision for psychiatric service. Although, of course, some people do need admission to hospital. And there is a very big emphasis on community-based mental health services, which are easily accessible and where people can get input at a very quick notice. And I'm praying that, again, the discussion we're having today will go beyond the walls to bring about change. I'm going to jump over this, but again, the WHO just emphasized the strategy that is required nationally to reduce suicide, which includes good leadership, appropriate intervention, the right vision, and evaluation, being able to monitor, undertake appropriate surveillance and research. And then in terms of preventing suicide, sorry about that, they came up with an acronym which I do think is important. L stands for less means. So we heard from our learned gentleman about how many people in this country commit suicide through drinking pesticides. In the United Kingdom, there are restrictions in place so that people like you and me do not have easy access. Likewise with their cars, there was a time in the United Kingdom where a common way of committing suicide was people would drive into their garages, close the door, and turn on the exhaust. They've changed the way cars are manufactured, so that is not a possibility. So less means. Interaction. I am sure that there are members of the media here, and I want to highlight that you, the media, are really important in working on reducing the risk of suicide. And I'm still going to come to the need for the media to report issues regarding suicide in a responsible manner. F, what we're focusing on today, form the young. We need to, the WHO expects that there is a focus on working with young people to reduce the risk of suicide in terms of life skills, building resilience and coping strategies. And E is for early identification. And I will say that that is appropriate no matter your age. The reality about mental illness or any kind of health issue is the quicker you get in, the less likely it is to have a bad prognosis and a bad outcome. So, before I then drill down to look a little bit more at schools, the national strategy highlights some of the problems. And I'm hoping that you would take this outside. One, a poor understanding of the problem. So we still need to do so much more work about people understanding mental health and mental illness. Poorly defined actions and interventions, ineffective or absent leadership. And at this point, I want to salute the Folashade International School and the Folashade Foundation for showing real leadership regarding this. Please, can you give them a round of applause? Other things that can block appropriate provision of mental health treatment is gaps in legislation and policy, a lack of funding, a lack of appropriate training, not reducing access to means of suicide, irresponsible media reporting, a lack of access to services, a lack of continuity of care, a lack of data collection, and as I said before, stigma. So at this point in time, I want to begin to talk about the factors which increase the risk of suicide in the young. And I am going to read a narrative that a young woman of Nigerian parentage wrote to me. I want to emphasize that I'm not her doctor, but I have the privilege of knowing her. And she kindly wrote this to give each one of us an insight into the minds of an individual, a young person who is feeling suicidal. So if you give me a few minutes just to find a particular page and read it out to you. just want to give some background. Miss X is of Nigerian heritage, and she's now in her early 20s. And this is what she wrote, and I ask you to please listen respectfully. My mom would tell me daily to be grateful for waking up every day as others didn't. If only she knew that I would pray every night I went to bed that I never woke up. I wish so badly that I was no longer here, but I didn't understand why I felt the way I did. All I knew was that I was tired. I was tired of always having to do better than my peers, tired of being the firstborn, tired of being the older cousin, tired of studying a course in university that I had no interest in, and tired of being compared to every other person. I was just exhausted. As a child, I just wanted my parents to say, "Well done." Instead, I was hearing, "Does Sam have 2 heads? Or what happened to the remaining mark you didn't get?" As an adult, I started to experience panic attacks and anxiety. I felt like I couldn't say anything because as a child, I was told that it was something that doesn't exist in Africans. It was for those who were not strong-minded. I would even mention to my dad that I was stressed, and his response would be to say to me, "How can you be stressed at your age? You haven't even experienced anything." I started to become very paranoid and extremely insecure, thinking that people were always staring at me for the wrong reasons. It didn't help that family would constantly comment on how much weight I had gained or how my skin or my hair was. I felt like I couldn't catch a break. Then the pressure of not knowing what I was going to do after university kicked in, with everybody giving their opinion on what they think is best for you, rather than asking what you really wanted to do. But the issue was not that I really didn't know. I had gone my whole life doing what always was asked of me and expected of me, that I never had a chance to find myself. I became very isolated and kept to myself and started to suffer from other health issues due to the extreme stress that I was under. It was during this period I was formally diagnosed with depression. Even after all of this, I'm still unable to tell my family what is going on with me. I still feel like they will never truly understand, and I don't want them to feel any guilt of thinking they failed as parents, as I understand that they did the best they possibly could. Now that was not made up by me. These are the words of a young woman that I know. Kindly share this so that you can have an understanding of the mindset of a young person who is suicidal. So when I sat down to analyze everything that she has said, there were a number of key things that I think will resonate with possibly not even young people, but people of any age when they're feeling suicidal. 1, feeling tired, exhausted about everything, unhappy and disinterested with university course, or it could be for adults, unhappy with their career, unhealthy comparisons with others. I'm very aware that we live in a culture where people are unduly compared with each other, a lack of parental validation, emerging mental health symptoms, the erroneous belief that Africans do not suffer from mental illness, the erroneous belief that mental illness equates to emotional weakness, a minimization of stress, negative comments on one's appearance, anxiety about the future, opinions not valued, a lack of identity or a lack of strong self-identity, and a lack of confiding relationship. You note at the end having these long-standing suicidal thoughts, she felt unable to tell her parents. So, just in case you're thinking that Miss X is unique, I went out to check out the Children's Society UK Good Children report. And the Children's Society is a non-governmental organisation in the UK which undertakes annual research on young people. And they came up with the following, which echo the very themes that Miss X put in her narrative. 1. 250,000 children in the UK between the ages of 10 to 15 say that they are unhappy. They claim that they're unhappy about their school, about education, about personal belongings or lack of them, and their physical appearance. The Children's Society also identified that a lot of young people worried about getting good marks in school, going to university, getting a job, having enough money. They also worried about their physical and their mental health. And ultimately, after qualifying, they worried about where they live. They also identified that young people had concerns and worried about the society, climate change, crime, the economy, and for those based in the UK, Brexit. They also had concerns that are identifiable here, social media and online safety. So in summary, what we find is because of the world that we live in, young people are unhappy, they are stressed, they are worried, and sadly they are depressed. And this increases the risk of suicide. At this stage, I feel that it's important as a clinician to explain what depression is from a clinical perspective. And I start out by saying that depression is not unhappiness. When I was coming today in the traffic, I was not happy because the traffic was extreme and I was running late. But I am not clinically depressed. And so, unhappiness is a natural response to happenings that make us unhappy. However, clinical depression is so much more. So some key facts on depression. Depression is a mental illness. It affects approximately 350 million people worldwide. 1 in 20 people globally suffers from depression. And the critical thing about depression is it affects function. And it is the leading cause of lost years in terms of disability. Symptoms of depression. As I said, depression is not just merely feeling unhappy. Although if you are depressed, you will be feeling unhappy. As a clinician, a person must have enduring low mood most of the day, almost every day, for a minimum of at least 2 weeks. Very classically, if somebody is suffering from clinical depression, their mood state is worse in the morning. I often come across patients who say it's very difficult for them to get out of bed. People suffering from clinical depression lose interest and do not experience pleasure in activities which previously would have given them great pleasure. They suffer from reduced energy levels, they are easily tired, and there's marked sleep disturbance. In fact, the classical sleep pattern for somebody suffering from clinical depression is they manage to fall asleep about 10, 11, 12, and by 3, 4 o'clock in the morning they're awake and they cannot go back to sleep. In addition, people suffering from clinical depression have appetite changes. They either don't eat or they eat too much. There's a change in what we call psychomotor activity, so they feel very agitated or they're extremely slowed down. People with clinical depression suffer from poor attention and concentration, and when it's marked, it impacts on their short-term memory. People with clinical depression are often indecisive. They suffer from unreasonable feelings of guilt and self-reproach. They experience continuous low self-esteem and loss of confidence. And the depressive symptoms may be associated with anxiety-like symptoms or somatic symptoms. And what do I mean by somatic symptoms? So the individual who complains of headaches or stomach aches, etc., but when they go to the doctor and they test no identifiable physical reason for the symptoms. There are a number of types of depression. Unipolar depression is when the person just suffers from depressive episodes, either one episode or successive episodes. Bipolar is a mental disorder where the person experiences periods of depression but also experiences periods when their mood is elevated. And then for women, a specific form of depression is postpartum depression, having clinical depression after the birth of a child. And of course, depression can occur in conjunction with other mental illnesses. Depression can be categorized as mild, moderate, and severe, and suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior is often associated with severe depression. Suicidal thoughts can also be associated with another form of mental illness called a psychosis. And psychosis, in layman's terms, is an illness in which the person loses contact with reality, and they will suffer from various forms of delusions, thinking which is not in contact with the culture, and various forms of hallucinations. So, I think it's important. The reason why I have described the depression in detail is because although not every person who ends their life with suicide is depressed, there is a very strong association between depression, suicidal ideation, and completed suicide. We've heard, but I'll repeat it again, the reason why it's so important for us to speak about suicide is because over 800,000 people annually die by ending their lives. Some things to bear in mind in factors that will increase the risk of depression and suicide. Any condition, whether it be physical, mental, or social, which is chronic and debilitating, can lead to depression and can increase the risk of suicide. In terms of mental health difficulties that include depression that I've mainly on, but also other things such as difficulties in terms of personality, alcohol dependence, and schizophrenia. In terms of physical illnesses, some illnesses that are associated with a high suicide risk is cancer, HIV, chronic pain, and neurological disorders. Very important for young people, and very important for this environment that we find ourselves in, are psychosocial difficulties. So in young people, there could be an increased suicide risk if there are interpersonal difficulties with parents, teachers, or their peers, if they have difficulties around their sexual orientation, if they have academic challenges, if they experience social isolation, if they are placed under unrealistic expectations, either by themselves, their parents, their teachers, difficulties with finances, bereavement within the family or close loved ones, and divorcing parents. But as we've heard earlier today from the learned gentleman, the strongest or the highest risk factor for suicide is a previous attempt at suicide. And research says that the risk of suicide is highest within a year of somebody attempting suicide. So again, we need to be vigilant that if somebody has attempted suicide, the risk is marked for the next 12 months. So, some principles I share with everybody, but I think I want to reiterate them here. 1, suicide is everybody's business. 2, nobody should go through the experience of being suicidal alone. And 3, we should have a low threshold for seeking help for ourselves or for others, including young people. So now I want to look at the Nigerian situation. I read a dissertation by one Mr. Lawal, and he identified, what he did was he did a literature review of the Nigerian media. And within the Nigerian media, the following were listed as causes of depression and suicide: emotional distress, stress, perceived personal shortcomings, guilt, physical illness, mental illness, rejection, death of a loved one, traumatic life events, negative actions of a significant other. I also read some of the papers by Professor Oyegureji, 2007 and 2011, and he identified factors for Nigeria which are very common globally. So one, the diagnosis of a mood disorder, and by that he's looking at either depression or bipolar affective disorder. A history of childhood adversity, I'm talking to parents and carers. Experiences in childhood can increase the risk of suicide in later life. Abuse, raised in a house where there's a lot of discord and tension and conflict. Maternal factors can also increase the risk of suicide in children. So mothers who have mental illness, or mothers who suffer or abuse substances. Another risk factor is early separation from parents. And they state specifically before the age of 16. And there is a high likelihood of suicide ideation and risk in individuals aged 18 to 34 in Nigeria. Another interesting paper that we read was by Professor who actually was my lecturer when I was at university. And he highlighted some of our cultural attitudes to mental illness. He highlighted that we are, in terms of mental health, quite illiterate. Because of the stigma, many people do not seek out support in a timely fashion. He noted that many people attribute mental illness to spiritual affliction, and so they're more likely to go to church than seek out a doctor. Our culture seems to believe that mental illness is a consequence of bad behavior or misdemeanors. He identified that many people think that mental illness is caused solely by drug abuse. He noted that the colors in this country for mental illness is that people are deemed as mad. And he also noted that individuals found it difficult to distinguish between being unhappy and being clinically depressed. And as highlighted from the letter by Ms. X, it was noted that culturally, those who attempt suicide are deemed as weak. And of course, there is a low propensity for accurate reporting due to stigma. So some more facts for us to understand about Nigeria. In terms of the psychosocial factors, 86 million people in Nigeria live below the poverty line, according to the World Bank 2017. There has been a 59% increase in poverty rates since 1990, and unfortunately there's marked social displacement. No wonder so many of us in this country are suicidal. Legislation also does not help. So as I alluded before, suicide in this country is deemed a criminal act under the provisions of Section 327. And very sadly, instead of attempted suicide being treated sympathetically, suicide survivors are liable to 1 year's imprisonment. Now, I'd like to say to you that a prison environment is a highly unconducive place for the recovery from mental illness. And of course, if you're mentally ill in prison, that will increase the risk of suicide. I'm a forensic psychiatrist in the UK, and the framework in the United Kingdom is about very prompt diversion. So somebody's remanded in custody and they are found to be mentally ill. The framework and the legislation is to quickly divert them into hospital with an understanding that even if an individual has even committed a crime but they're mentally ill, what is required first and foremost is treatment for the mental illness. Coming back to our statistics here, we found, researchers found that the high suicide rates were in a number of states, which I think is linked to poverty in urban areas. I also want to touch on the media impact, which was identified in reading Nigerian research papers. there was something identified called the Werther effect, and essentially it's it's a word which denotes the impact that media can have on the suicide risk. And what was identified is that if the media does not report responsibly, it can lead to an increase in suicide. And so highly sensationalized reporting of suicide, limited mention of the fact that suicide is often linked to mental illness. Many of the reports in the Nigerian press were written without any kind of psychoeducation or signposting in terms of where to get help if one is suffering from mental illness or depression or feeling suicidal. Also, literature shows that Generation X, those are individuals who were born between 1995 and 2015, are highly affected by social media. And the Nigerian research shows that many of them become exposed to information which is not age appropriate. And all of these factors can contribute to depression and mental illness and suicide. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to highlight that just like in other places of the world, drug and alcohol abuse can impact on mental state and increase the risk of suicide. First and foremost, intoxicants have a disinhibitory effect on people, any of us. They impair problem solving and consequential thinking, and they can precipitate long-standing mental illness. It's also important to note, many people don't know that alcohol abuse can precipitate one into depression. And in fact, a lot of times in my clinical practice, when I'm managing people who are suffering from alcohol dependence, I have to explain to them that it's very difficult for me to determine whether they really have depression or whether the depressed mood they have is a side effect of their alcohol abuse. Of course, people often abuse alcohol because they are psychologically distressed, so it's like a chicken and egg situation. So, we're focusing on the youth, and what you'll find up here is a list of warning signs, and I would like everybody who works with young people to please note these down. In young people who are actively suicidal, some of the following, or all of the following, will be identified. They will talk about making plans for suicide. They will express hopelessness about the future. They will display overwhelming emotional pain or distress. They will show worrisome behavior. Typically, young people may not necessarily say they're depressed, but you will see marked changes in their behavior. So the very quiet person who suddenly becomes loud and gregarious, or the person who's very social, who suddenly becomes very isolated. Suicidal young people often start withdrawing from social connections and social interactions. There will be changes in sleep pattern. They often show unhealthy bouts of anger, and they can express extreme degrees of agitation or irritability. So, we've talked about the global perspective on suicide. I've touched upon the statistics. I brought it home to Nigeria about why this environment is very toxic, and is therefore we have increased why suicide is on the rise in our populations. I've made the link between depression and suicide. I've listed some of the symptoms that you will find in young people and in the general population for people who are depressed and suicidal. The next thing we need to think about is about suicide prevention. What I'm going to do is I'll put up a summary, and then I'm going to delve into some specifics as I round up. So some key elements of suicide prevention. 1, emotional and life skills training for children and young people. One of the challenges of today's young people is that they do not have resilience. My dear parents and carers, I am a mother. My children now are in their 20s. And one of the things I had to learn as a parent was it was not good for me to give them everything that they wanted. I also had to learn that it was important to teach them coping strategies so that when life hits, they would not crumble. Many of our young people have been spoiled. and so that when life hits, they are unable to cope. 2, part of what we're doing today, there needs to be high-quality surveillance for suicide and parasuicide both at home and in school. So what we're doing today, learning about the symptoms of depression, learning about the symptoms of suicide, and being able to identify such in our young people. 3, I also add, under that second bit, that there is a need in school for there to be very robust pastoral care. 3, gatekeeping training for teachers. What do I mean by that? It is very important that people who are working with young people, I use teachers generically because yes, teachers, but anybody who's working with young people needs to have what I call gatekeeping training, which is being able to identify when young people are depressed, being able to identify when people have mental health difficulties, being able to identify when young people are using substances, and being able to provide or signpost them to the appropriate interventions. 5, awareness training for parents and carers. So parents and caregivers also need to be au fait with symptoms of mental illness, depression, suicidal symptoms, and drug abuse. And last but not least, in this generation, young people want to be included. So if there are any strategies that you want to implement either at home or in school, it's really important that the young people are involved in these packages so that you can hear from them what they think will work. Because sometimes as adults, we think we know how to solve the problem without including the young people. And one of the challenges that we've identified from some of the things I said today is young people feeling that they're not heard, they're not valued, they're not respected, they're not regarded. So, I want to drill down now to parents. Parents, you have an important role, parents and carers, you have an important role in reducing the risk of suicide. I want to say, because I speak now as a mother and a parent, that we parents are the primary educators of our children. It's not the school, it is you, the parents. Parents need to provide strong foundations for their children. Parents need to be mindful of whom and what is being inputted into the lives of their children and young people. I completely understand in this environment that many of us work long hours, but you need to have a think about who is looking after your children. That uneducated house girl, if she spends more time with your children than you do, you might be storing up problems for your future. It's also important to highlight that when we leave our children, especially young children, in the hands of house helps, etc., for extended periods, and in the hands of people who are not trained, we can increase the risk of physical abuse and sexual abuse. And one of the key factors for suicidal risk in life, later on in life, is trauma, including abuse. As parents, we need to understand that the school cannot substitute for our role as parents. Schools have to build on what we, the parents, have done at home. Parents need to nurture their children and support their children to have a healthy identity. You remember from Miss X's narrative, she spoke about the fact that she didn't know who she was. She's in her 20s. But because of all sorts of different things, she doesn't have a strong self-identity. And parents and carers, as I've said before, I'll say it again, we need to recognize when there's something going on with our children and recognize mental distress. So, talking about identity, I am aware that Dr. Kadiri last year spoke about parenting, and I'm just going to go in a slightly different dimension and talk a little bit about identity. As I was preparing for this lecture, I heard Dr. Cindy Trim speak about identity. She is an American evangelist, but she's also a motivational speaker. She's a woman who came from poverty, and now I think she became the Prime Minister of her country, Barbados. And she said that basically, that in terms of identity, there are a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I want to suggest to you parents that you need to support your children of course it has to be age appropriate, to be able to answer these questions, because when they have the right answers to these questions, they will have a strong identity. So, where did I come from? What's my heritage? I wouldn't necessarily talk about God if I was in UK, due to the culture, but I know I'm back home, where most, if not all of us, have a strong faith in God. 2, what was I born into? Ensuring that your children understand their family heritage is really important in giving them a sense of belonging. 3, who am I? Children need to understand their aptitude, their spiritual giftings, what makes them tick, what type of personality they have, and how their experiences shape their view of the world. 4, why was I born? We need to help our children understand their purpose for living. 5, where do I want to be? Children need to be taught how to think about the next 5 years, 10 years, what their destiny is, what they're working to achieve in life. 6, how do I get there? We as parents need to support our children to gain the knowledge and learning which is required to fulfill identity. 6, what should I be doing? What's my life assignment? What am I put on the earth to do? You may think it very strange, but I remember that as a teenager and in my early 20s, because of certain issues in my family and mental health difficulties, I knew that I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I knew I wanted to work in mental health. I have to say that my father was not excited about this at all, and neither were my friends. My father said to me, why can't you be a surgeon like your uncle? My friend said, Shade, you will be as mad as the mad people you want to treat. But you know what? Today, now in this 2019, people are now beginning to talk about mental illness. And I believe that God has put me on this earth to help drive and change that narrative in this country. So, I ask you, and I ask you to ask your children, what were they born to do? Of course, depending on what you're called to do, you need to have the skills. Timing is everything in terms of what should you be doing. So of course, when you're in school, you should be studying. With whom should I be doing it with? Relationships are everything. If I did not have a personal relationship with Princess Beju, I would not be standing here. She knew me, she's known me forever, and that's why she knows that I'm a mental health expert. What resources will be required? And how will the generation know in terms of leaving a legacy? Now this may all sound very esoteric, but the reality is that people who have a strong sense of identity are less likely to succumb to suicidal ideation, even when the going gets tough and they actually feel it, because they remember why they're here. They remember that they have a sense of calling. They remember they have a purpose. But when you don't have a strong sense of identity, it is very difficult to succumb to the storms of life. Of course, I do have to emphasize that when people are severely depressed, they often do not have control over their behavior. So, I want to talk a little bit about parenting, and I'm almost rounding up, I'm aware of time. Sorry. So, in terms of parenting scheme, then we're looking at suicide prevention. I want to parent, child, and God. So in terms of parents, it is very important, parents, that you demonstrate a healthy commitment to co-parenting. Yes, I know that life happens. I know that sometimes people get divorced or problems happen. But I find it very distressing, and it has a negative impact on your children when you're not able to lay aside your differences to respectfully co-parent your children. Your children learn about the world and relationships primarily from their parents and carers before anybody else. And so even if you are divorced from the other side, and I know it takes two to tango, the aim should be to be able to respectfully co-parent the child. There is an adage, I believe, in Yoruba that says that when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And when parents don't have a healthy or respectful relationship between them, it is the children who suffer trauma. Parent to child. talking about our parenting skills. As parents, we must always demonstrate to the child that they are valued and that their opinion is respected. I said respected, I didn't necessarily say agreed with. There are many times that my children have come up with things over the years. I have not necessarily agreed with them, but I've shown them that I do respect their views, even if I don't share their views. As parents, we must provide unconditional love. I tell my kids, although they're not kids anymore, they're adults, that I don't always like what they do. I don't always like what they've done. But my love for them is unconditional. It's very important as parents that we give our children that strong foundation that no matter what they do, you will love them unconditionally. Note, I didn't say you have to love their behavior, but that you love them. We also, as parents, need to make sure that our children feel safe and secure. And we need to let them know that we will believe them. More and more as I do the work that I do and the places I go to, I hear about people who have been abused, either physically or sexually, and they have approached their parents, and their parents have not believed them. There's nothing more damaging than somebody being abused than for them to approach their parents and for them to be re-traumatized because their parents do not believe them, or their parents put their, shall I say, social status, etc., above the welfare of their young child or adult. We must provide, as parents, consistent emotional support and comfort. We need to prioritize time spent with our children. True story, I remember once going on a cruise with some of my girlfriends, and when I came back, I asked my children, this is going back 10 years, did they miss me? Ouch! My daughter said to me, what is there to miss, Mom? You're always at work. I had to reorganize my lifestyle very, very quickly. Foster good, open communication. Maybe because of the job I do and the people I work with, I work in forensic psychiatry, which is the extreme end of psychiatry where people have killed and raped, etc. There is nothing that shocks me. By the grace of God, I can listen to anything. And over the years, I found that even my children's friends come and talk to me because they know I can listen. And the reality is, as a parent or a carer, if your children are not talking to you, they are talking to somebody. And whoever they're talking to may be sowing the wrong things into their head, into their mind. So as parents, we need to try and step up and get more robust and have an ability to listen and have dialogue with our children. Because if they're not talking to you and you're not talking to them, you're putting them at harm's risk. And also as parents, as I've touched on before, we need to make sure that our children have good consequential and problem-solving abilities. So age appropriate, give them more responsibility. And then because I am in Nigeria, where many of us believe in God, I think parents should support children to have a strong relationship with God. But of course, having a relationship with God doesn't mean that we abdicate all personal responsibility. Children and young adults, they benefit from a strong but not radicalized faith. So I'm not preaching extremes. What I'm saying is that having a strong faith in God can keep somebody rooted and grounded, especially in the hard times of life. Children benefit from a strong moral compass. I actually know somebody in my family who doesn't really believe in God per se, but takes his children to church every Sunday because he knows that the church will imbibe strong moral values in the children. And I would say, and this is a personal view and you may not share it, that a strong foundation and faith in God helps us weather the storms of life. And the storms of life will come to all of us. So I've talked about the role of parents in terms of preventing or reducing the risk of suicide. Now I want to talk about the role of schools. To the educational institutions, as I've said to the parents, you are not the parents. Your role is to build on, hopefully, the good foundation that the parents have already deposited in their children. These are the attributes of a good school, and I put them up there because I believe that a good school environment will reduce the risk of suicide. A good school, according to Professor Brian Hill, an educationist from Australia, will enable the child or young adult to maintain a stable and positive self-image, will enable the child or young adult to develop pro-social survival skills appropriate to their culture, will enable the young child or adult to develop personal creative skills, to gain access to major fields of human thought and experience, to become aware of dominant worldviews, to develop critical thinking and choose responsibly, to develop empathy and respect for others. So now I want to talk about the pros and cons of boarding school. And before I say anything, I want to highlight that my younger daughter spent a stint in boarding school, and I can still see the benefits in my daughter, who is now almost 25 till today. But like anything in life, boarding schools have pros and they have cons. So what are the pros? What are the advantages of boarding schools? Most boarding schools provide a high standard of academics. It also means that the parents don't have to double as teachers in the home environment because the requisite teaching is being provided in the school environment. The boarding school environment in a good boarding school is structured and it provides consistency. It offers external containment, so there are boundaries that the child understands. Good boarding schools provide a wide range of diverse extracurricular activities. And it's an environment where the young people learn to develop strong relationships with their peers. And it promotes independence. My younger daughter is one of the most independent people I know. And I know that she developed that from the period that she was in boarding school. However, as I said, boarding schools can also have some disadvantages. A boarding school environment is very different, if we're being honest, from real life. So children in boarding school can, inverted commas, be isolated from real life. Depending on what age the child goes to boarding school, there can be early separation from parents. And research shows that actually separation from parents before the age of 6 is very detrimental. And ideally, researchers would say that depending on the child, that separation from the parent before the age of 16 can be difficult or could potentially have adverse effects. A boarding school, as I said, school are not parents. So in a boarding school environment, children may not necessarily get individualized care. And sometimes, especially if children are sent to boarding schools in a different culture abroad, they may be separated from their indigenous culture. Boarding schools potentially may have different religious or philosophical views from parents, which could be confusing for the children. And when we talk about mental health difficulties, by the very nature of a boarding school, it may be more difficult to pick up mental health difficulties. That's not blaming the schools, that's just the reality. Therefore, I say to boarding schools, exercise extreme caution if you're admitting a child who has known mental health difficulties. It's really important as a school that you consult closely with those providing mental health treatment on the suitability of boarding school. And there need to be precautions put in place to reduce risk if it's deemed appropriate for the child to come to boarding school. I say to parents that, not going off on a tangent, that as a parent, you need to exercise care about whether a boarding school is the right environment for your child. It is very unfair to the child. It's also very unfair to the school if the child has active mental health problems and you have not informed the school prior to admission. One of the ways in which schools can reduce the risk of suicide is through robust pastoral care. And by that, I mean the provisions made by the school in terms of processes, protocols and procedures to safeguard the emotional and physical welfare of their pupils. I'm aware that there is a speaker talking about pastoral care, so I'm not going to go into details, but I just want to highlight some of the elements of robust pastoral care. So one, safeguarding, preventing abuse and ensuring safety and protection. including procedures to reduce the risk of harassment and bullying. 2, procedures to deal with accident and illness. Of course, security of school premises, child welfare, teaching children how to keep themselves safe, promoting good behavior in the children, promoting physical and mental well-being, provision of regular contact between pupils and designated tutors, teachers, residential staff to monitor well-being, input, where appropriate, of educational, clinical psychologists, counsellors, with prompt signposting to more specialised care indicated, and procedures to promote prompt liaison between the school and parents where difficulties have been identified. I was specifically asked by Folashade International School to also consider culture in terms of suicide prevention. So when we use the word culture, we're thinking about an environment of shared ideas, customs and social behaviours of a particular people or society. And really in terms of culture and individuals, whether young or old, we can either say that somebody has cultural balance or cultural dissonance. Cultural balance means that both internally and externally, the person is in sync with a given culture. Cultural dissonance is when there is some kind of disconnect between internal and external. So I'll give an example, personal example. You may recall that I said I was born in England and I went back to Nigeria when I was almost 10, going on 11. I had had English foster, and so I knew very little about the Nigerian culture. I then got transplanted from a place in Essex that if I name most of you would never have heard of, it's so small, and ended up in Lagos, Nigeria. I didn't understand the culture, I didn't speak the language, I didn't even really know my parents properly. And I'd been given no prior warning. We were just very sudden, me and my younger brother, whisked to Nigeria. It was a real example of cultural dissonance. It took me years to begin to feel at home, to fit in. And sometimes, if I'm honest, even now at the grand age of 55, there are moments where I feel like I don't fit in. Sometimes I feel like I don't fit in the UK. Sometimes I feel like I don't fit in Nigeria. And that is as a result of the fact, I'm not saying it belongs to cross cultures, but because I was not prepared, and I am not blaming my parents, they did the best that they knew how. But I guess what I'm trying to say or to highlight is that if children or young people need to change cultures, then there needs to be preparation. When you change culture, when you move culture, whether it's for school or relocation, there is a process. Involvement, one, is talking about the lifestyle you've had in the old culture that you're familiar with. Then there is a process of leaving and transitioning. So you're leaving the old culture and transitioning into the new. And then over a period of time, when you get into the new culture, you have to become integrated into the culture. And I say it from personal experience, it is not easy, especially if you've not had any preparation. Many times when people have to transition cultures, whether it's from home to school or going to a completely different country, there will be losses. The losses may be separation and loss of regular contact with parents if children are moving to boarding school abroad. There may be separation or loss of regular contact with siblings if they're going to different schools. Loss of parental role models in boarding school. I'm almost finished. Yeah, I'm almost finished. Confused and conflicting loyalties between cultural environments. Ignorance of a host culture. Loneliness and social isolation. And all of this can trigger a grief process. The grief process very quickly starts off with denial. Then there's anger. Bargaining is when you begin to come to the reality of your loss. It normally then results in depression, and then finally acceptance of the new reality. However, when people have not been prepared for transition, they can get stuck at any part of those processes, and it may trigger depression. I'm going to end, because of course this is about suicide prevention, I want to end on kind of teaching all of us a strategy, so that if we notice that somebody is suicidal, we can intervene appropriately. And I'm going to put the link up there, and I hope people will note it down. So the Zero Suicide Alliance was a coalition in the United Kingdom of health trusts, businesses and individuals who were committed to suicide prevention in the UK. And the strategy was to raise awareness and promote free suicide training, which was accessible to all, and it's still accessible to all online. And the aim was to develop awareness, motivation, and confidence so that any one of us, whether we're mental health practitioners or not, we can identify when somebody is suicidal and intervene. So there are three parts of this strategy: see, say, signpost. Can I hear everybody say that?
See, say, signpost.
Can we say it again?
See, say, signpost.
So C is being able to identify the signs of depression and suicide, and I've discussed those extensively. But it's not enough to see. The next thing is a say. And say is about being able to approach the person that we think has mental health difficulties or is suicide and have a conversation. Many people are scared to talk to somebody even when they think they're suicidal because they think they will make it worse. I want to tell you that if you employ empathy and sensitivity, most suicidal people will be glad to have somebody to listen. You know, listening is sharing the burden, making them feel understood, and it's likely to reduce the risk of them acting. But beyond seeing and saying, signposting. So being enabled, empowered to be able to sign people who are suicidal or depressed to the right services. This is the link. I checked it myself. It can be accessed anywhere in the world, including right here. So if you can take that link, what it does, it will take you to the online training. It's about, I think, 20-30 minutes. I did it, even though I'm a mental health practitioner, and I found it useful. Has everybody got that? Finally, this is not an inexhaustible list of support services in this country, and I deliberately did not name the stakeholders for today. But of course, in our environment, if you identify that somebody is suicidal, it's important that we signpost them to the right sources of help. I end up by saying, again, today's World Mental Health Day. It's a day of 40 seconds of action. Thank you for listening. Let's continue.